Welcome to this installment of Levine Automotive's how-to tech video. Today we're going to be covering basic scratch repair with an aerosol kit. Here in this quarter panel we have a series of scratches. We've attempted to buff them, but they're a little bit too deep. We can feel them with our fingernail, something that's just not going to buff. It's going to require sanding, priming, and painting. What we look at with a repair like this is the placement of the scratch, which is basically in the center of the panel. We're far enough away from the door and any other panel that we have to be concerned with color match. So what we're going to look to do is keep this repair, the paintwork, within this body line and the bottom of the panel. With that being said, we're going to grab some Prep-Sol and start the repair. Okay, so the first step to any repair is making sure that we have a good clean surface. So we're going to start with this aerosol Prep-Sol agent here. We're going to apply the entire panel, wetting it down, taking a clean rag, trying to wipe it off in one direction. Make sure that it stays wet. If it starts to dry up, you can always come back and reapply the prepping agent again. You do want to make sure that you have all debris off the surface and that it's clean and ready to go. Trying not to move around in circles, trying to wipe that off in one direction. Make sure that the panel is free of all debris. Once we have the panel cleaned, then we're ready to move forward and sand the scratches out. Okay, so ready to start taking the scratches out of this panel. We want to keep the repair area as small as possible, but also make sure that we get these scratches out 100% with a decent feather edge. We're going to start by dry sanding with 180 grit on a sanding block. And you see they're pretty deep, so we're going to have to go down probably till we see primer. We're going to try to achieve a decent feather edge here. Now I can see that my scratches have been sanded out, but I want to make this edge a little bit smoother. I want to go to a 320 grit, P320 grit wet paper, and we're going to step this repair out a little bit farther. My bucket of clean water, and now we start working around the outside edges of this, knocking down that 180 grit scratch. I just want to check my work, wipe down the repair area. We see we have our feather edge, no sign of the scratches, and we're finished off in a 320 grit. From here, we're going to get this panel ready for priming, come back and see how that's done. Okay, so now we're ready to move into the priming aspect of the repair. We have the vehicle taped up, we're sanded with a 320 grit around the edges. We've cleaned the panel once again. Very important to always keep the panel clean. And when we mask, I gave myself plenty of room around the repair area. One thing you want to avoid whenever masking is getting your paper too close to that repair area. I don't want it on the sanded area. What happens is when you prime, you wind up giving yourself a hard primer line. That's harder to sand out and sometimes can show through in the finished product. So give yourself plenty of room around the repair for priming. Get your aerosol primer, make sure that it's shaken thoroughly, and before you start applying primer to the panel, use this masking paper just to make sure that the can is spraying the way you want it. We're going to give this 3 coats. We're going to put the first coat down, we'll give it several minutes of flash time before we move on to our second and third coat. This will vary depending upon temperature. Obviously, in summer months, primer is going to dry a little bit faster than it will in winter months. If you're doing this when the weather's a little bit cooler, you can use a hair dryer or heat gun, heat lamp, something just to warm up that panel and speed up the drying process. But again, it's important to apply a coat, let it dry, move on to your second coat, again, allowing a few minutes in between each coat. So with that being said, we're going to apply this first coat. Spraying the way we want it, and we apply our first coat. And that's really all I want in my first coat. Again, we're going to give this a couple minutes, come back and apply our second coat. Okay, so it's been several minutes. Our first coat of primer is flashed off. I can still see through it, it's a little transparent. Want to make sure that I get enough build on there to fill that 180 scratch that we put in there with the dry sanding paper. So I'm going to apply my second coat. I still want to try to keep it within this area on the sanded part of the panel. A little gets onto the shiny part, it's okay, you can sand it back, but ultimately try to keep your primer on the sanded area. Again, testing to make sure that my can is spraying all right, then I move forward with the second coat. And that's really all you need. We're going to give that a few more minutes to flash off, come back, and do our third and final coat. Back for our third and final coat. Again, that second coat dried for several minutes. We just want to shake up our can again, make sure that it's going to spray correctly. Test it one more time. We look good. Third coat of primer has been applied. We're going to give that several minutes to dry. We're going to come back, sand the repair, and get it ready for paint. Okay, so I've allowed my primer to dry now for about half an hour. We're ready to start sanding. Notice that I left some of my masking in place. Reason for that is, after we sand the primer, we're going to sand the rest of this panel. This is going to keep the adjacent panels protected, so when I'm sanding up close to the edges, I don't get sand scratches onto the next panel, bumper, door, tail light, or any other panel that you might be working with. So we're going to start sanding our primer spot, and again, trying to keep it just in the primer spot area using a 600 grit wet. Just sanding lightly, don't need a lot of pressure. And sanding all the way around the edges, making sure we have a smooth finish to work with. What I'll do is use my sanding block to wipe that away like a squeegee and make sure that I have all the edges sanded. That looks good. I don't see any of the scratches showing through. So I'm actually going to take a piece of 1000 grit wet, and now I'm going to continue to keep on sanding the rest of the panel. This can be done with a block or by hand, and you can move back up onto that primered area. It's not going to hurt anything. The important part is that I get this area sanded thoroughly and deglossed. I don't want any shiny spots before I go to paint. Once I've gotten to the point where I think I have this panel thoroughly sanded, I grab my block, use it like a squeegee, wipe the panel off, and just check it to confirm that I am deglossed, that I got everything sanded. Using a rag, wiping it down. And if you can, try not to do this in the sun. If you allow this wet primer and debris to dry up here, the sun will bake it on. It can be a little hard to remove, and it might show through in your paint job. So again, if possible, try to avoid wet sanding in the direct sunlight. Okay, so we've completed the wet sanding, looked at the panel, pretty happy, we're pretty well deglossed. There are some hard to get areas next to your lights, possibly emblems, around moldings. You want to make sure, again, that we have no shiny spots. So I'm going to take a gray Scotch pad and I'm just going to go around my edges, make sure that I get all my edges thoroughly, that they're deglossed just like the rest of this panel. And here again, I have a body line that I'm going to use for my clear coat. That's where I'm going to end my clear coat. So I've sanded up to that line. Same thing here where I have this body line. I have a piece of tape across the top. What I want to do next is grab some clean rags, wipe the panel down one more time before we move forward to paint. Grab my aerosol cleaner, wet it up, wipe it down. I try to wipe till it's dry. I don't want to leave any of that Prepsol on there to dry on the panel. You notice I do have a hard tape line across the top. What I'm going to do is take a piece of 1.5 or 2 inch tape, and we're going to do what we call a back mask, roll that edge to avoid getting a hard clear line on that panel. So I take my 1.5 tape, I try to apply it right on the body line. And you'll notice it's rolled back. Again, now when that clear coat hits the panel, it'll be a softer edge. It won't be a hard edge, which is going to be harder to buff, or might be more visible when the repair is completed. So I do the same thing on this lower body line over here. Alright, so we're ready for tacking it off and applying our first coat of base coat. Okay, so we're ready to apply our first coat of color. Make sure again that we thoroughly agitate the can, and we're going to give it a test spray on the masking below. Take my tack rag. Be careful when choosing a tack rag. Some of the ones you might find at Home Depot or your hardware store might be a little too sticky. A little of that glue can come off, stick to the panel, and ruin the paint job. So try to stick with a tack rag that's geared more towards automotive repair. So I'm going to take my tack rag, wipe off the panel, even some of the masking paper around that area, and we're going to apply our first coat of color. And that's really all we want. We'll see through it, that's fine. A lighter coat will dry faster. Trying to keep that area small. I don't put color over the entire panel. I want to get my primer spot covered first, and then we're going to step it out and blend it into that panel. Okay, it's been a couple minutes. My first coat of base has dried. Take my tack rag, wipe it off one more time. It is important to make sure that the color is dry before you drag your tack rag through it, otherwise you'd be sanding and starting to repair over. Shake up our can, give it a test spray, apply one more coat of base. Again, keeping it as small as I can. Each step, I step out my color a little bit further until we achieve hiding on that primer spot. So again, we're going to give this a couple minutes to dry. We'll come back, apply another coat, and again, step it out a little bit farther. Okay, so we're ready to move to our third and final coat. With this particular repair, we're able to get away with 3 coats, achieve coverage and our blend. That may differ depending on the color you're working with. Again, we were working with a red primer underneath a red color. 3 coats, we're done. It may take more or less coats to achieve your repair, again, depending on that color. So at this point, agitate our can, tack it off one more time. Give it a test spray and apply our last coat. Notice on that last coat, I stepped it out, kind of made it my final blend, made it a little bit bigger. But again, I don't really have much color showing on these edges where it might show a difference between that next panel. Just enough to make that blend. So with that, we're going to give this a few minutes to dry off. We're going to come back and apply our first coat of clear coat. Okay, so I've given our base coat about 10 minutes to dry. We're ready to apply our first coat of clear coat. Again, agitate the can thoroughly. We're going to give it a test spray. Notice on my first coat, I want to avoid putting a full coat up to the body line here and that body line there. We're going to go with a total of 3 coats, which is going to give me a little bit of mill thickness to work with so I can sand and buff any imperfections out later. But again, my first coat will go to the hard lines, my adjacent panels, but avoiding my body lines where I want to make a softer edge. There's my first coat. Again, avoided hitting that tape line up there. We're going to give that several minutes to dry, come back and apply our second coat. Alright, we're getting ready for our second coat of clear coat. At this point, I am not going to tack in between coats of clear coat. I let it flash for a few minutes and apply another coat over this, again stepping it up a little bit closer to that body line that I'm going to use for my blend. Again, giving it a few minutes to dry, we're going to come back and apply our third and final coat. Okay, so we're back. This has had about 10 minutes now to dry. I'm getting ready to apply my third and final coat. Do keep in mind, if you plan on buffing, that you put a minimum of 3 coats on. You might be looking at 4 to 5 coats depending on how substantial you want to get into, how substantial the buffing is going to be once this panel is completed. Look for that buffing in another installment of the Levine how-to tech videos that's going to be coming up. But at this point, we're ready to go with the third and final coat. So, test spray, and apply our third and final coat. And you'll notice on that last pass that I went right up to the edge. You can see that the clear went up onto the paper. I now peel back that last piece of tape that I put on there. And you shouldn't see any of that sanded area poking through. Now I have a less visible edge. The panel's clear coated. The repair is complete.